Olivia Bennett expected nothing more than a quiet, uneventful flight from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. She had booked first-class weeks in advance, hoping to spend the journey reviewing her keynote speech for one of the year's biggest business conferences. But from the moment she stepped on board, the air shifted, charged, uneasy, like a storm waiting to break. In seat 2A sat a man with polished shoes and an ego to match. Without glancing up, he swirled a glass of wine and muttered, "Ma'am, your seat's not here. Coach is that way." His words dripped with arrogance. Olivia, composed but firm, replied, "Actually, this is my seat." He waved her off, as if she were a nuisance, something to be ignored. But Olivia Bennett wasn't just any traveler. She was the CEO of a leading global tech firm, a woman who had built her success from the ground up. Yet here she was, being dismissed before even settling into her seat. Around them, the cabin fell into a heavy silence. Attendants exchanged uneasy glances. First-class passengers sat frozen, watching, listening. No one moved, no one spoke. Olivia didn't raise her voice or argue. Instead, she pulled out her phone and made a single call. Quiet, calculated. The kind of call that doesn't just resolve a situation, it rewrites the rules. What was supposed to be just another Monday flight had turned into something far greater. For Olivia, the moment wasn't about confrontation. It was about principle. She had paid for her seat, earned her place, and wasn't about to let anyone reduce her to something less. The man, Thomas Walker, early 40s, perfectly styled, comfortably entitled, didn't even try to hide his contempt. "This section's not for people like you," he said, loud enough for every passenger to hear. His words echoed through the cabin like a slap. A young flight attendant stood motionless, unsure whether to step in or shrink back. A couple in row 4 exchanged glances. "Did you hear what he said to her?" the woman whispered. Her partner looked away, ashamed but silent. Olivia didn't flinch. Her posture was unshaken, her voice calm. "This is my seat." The weight of the moment hung in the air. Passengers whispered. Someone raised a phone, quietly recording. Tension rippled through the cabin, and through it all, Olivia stood tall, not just for herself, but for every person who's ever been told they didn't belong. What came next wasn't about a seat, it was about dignity, and the entire plane knew it. For Thomas Walker, using wealth and influence to push others down wasn't new, it was habit, a performance he had perfected. But Olivia Bennett wasn't about to let herself be drawn into a scene. She took a breath, steady and deep, keeping her emotions in check. Losing her composure would only give his kind more fuel. Instead, she opened her phone with a calm hand, scrolled through her contacts, and tapped one name, Emily Harris, her trusted assistant. "Emily," she said gently, her voice controlled but firm. "I'm on flight DL 1486 to DC. Someone's in my seat and refuses to move. Please take care of it discreetly. Thank you." She hung up and slid the phone back into her pocket without looking at Thomas, though she stood close enough for him to feel the weight of her presence. Finally, a young flight attendant gathered the courage to step forward. Her voice, polite but hesitant, broke the silence. "Mr. Walker, there might be a mistake. Could you check your boarding pass, please?" Thomas didn't even bother hiding his annoyance. His voice dripped with disdain. "I'm not mistaken. Check again. I'm a platinum member. I always sit here." Olivia didn't respond. Her face remained calm, but her mind raced through 1,000 memories of boardroom battles, high-stakes negotiations, and countless moments where she had to prove herself twice over. She knew this was no longer about a seat. It was about dignity, about the quiet strength it takes to hold your ground when others expect you to fold. And so, she stood, silent, resolute. Thomas, meanwhile, kept up his performance. He tapped his wine glass, letting the faint clink echo through the tense cabin like a signal that he still held the stage. Around him, passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered, some glanced down, but no one stepped in. In row 4, a woman leaned toward her husband and whispered, "The way he spoke to her, so wrong." Her husband nodded, ashamed, but said nothing. He turned his eyes to a magazine, the universal gesture of avoidance. A few seats back, 2 younger professionals quietly pulled out their phones. Their expressions were tight, focused. They understood what was happening wasn't just about airline policy. It was a moment that might be seen around the world. Thomas didn't seem to care. To him, power wasn't something earned. It was something expected, worn like a badge, reinforced by tone, posture, and skin tone. Then a second attendant, slightly older, slightly braver, stepped forward. Her voice still trembled slightly, but it held more steel. "Sir, may I please see your boarding pass again? We need to verify the seating assignment." Thomas didn't flinch. "Do you know who I am?" he said, just loud enough for the nearby rows to hear. "I fly this route every week. Your system must be wrong. I always sit here." It wasn't a request. It was a declaration, a threat disguised as routine. The attendant turned briefly to Olivia, uncertainty in her eyes. Olivia gave a slight nod, calm and encouraging. Not a flicker of irritation crossed her face. Every second that passed made something clearer to the cabin. This man wasn't just mistaken. He was using his status as a weapon. The cabin had transformed into something far more than a place of travel. It was now a quiet stage, with every eye focused on the divide between arrogance and quiet strength. Olivia Bennett stood tall, her silence louder than any confrontation, and the phone still recorded, capturing a moment that no one would soon forget. Because Thomas Walker didn't realize, the world was watching. Let me know if you'd like the resolution segment next, when the situation is finally resolved and the tide turns. Here's a rephrased version of the new section, preserving the original meaning while enhancing storytelling flow, emotional stakes, and YouTube-suitable phrasing. Thomas Walker didn't realize it, but with every arrogant word, he was sinking deeper, triggering a shift in the cabin that even silence couldn't hide. For Olivia, standing firm wasn't about pride. It was about principle. Her posture, her composure, the quiet strength in her eyes, all of it spoke louder than any argument. She knew that in moments like these, dignity was power. And justice, when delivered quietly, carried more weight than any outburst ever could. As the cabin reached its breaking point, a figure appeared at the front, tall, composed, and immediately commanding attention. Captain Marcus Reed stepped out of the cockpit, his presence cutting through the tension like a blade. A seasoned pilot with over 3 decades of experience, Marcus was respected not only for his skill, but for his calm authority in crisis. He wasn't alone. 2 flight attendants and an airport security officer flanked him, their appearance sending a clear signal. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was now a serious matter. Captain Reed's eyes briefly met Olivia's. A flicker of understanding passed between them. Then he turned to Thomas Walker, his voice cool, steady, and unmistakably firm. "Sir, please present your boarding pass." Thomas blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't expected the captain himself to get involved. His smugness faltered, replaced by irritation. "Excuse me?" he snapped. "Do you even know who I am? I'm a platinum VIP. I fly this route every week. You need to fix your system, not me." But Marcus didn't flinch. He'd seen passengers like this before, men who believed wealth or frequent flyer miles made them untouchable. His response was measured but unyielding. "Mr. Walker, this is not a personal request. It's a flight safety protocol. We need to confirm your seat assignment for the safety and order of this aircraft. Please comply." Thomas's face reddened. He clenched his jaw, his voice rising. "I told you, I always sit here, and now you're asking me to move for her?" He practically spat the last word. Still, Marcus stood his ground. He wasn't just enforcing policy. He was drawing a line, not just as captain of the aircraft, but as a man unwilling to tolerate open disrespect cloaked in entitlement. "Mr. Walker," he said again calmly, "if you refuse to comply, we'll be forced to take further action. This is your final opportunity to cooperate voluntarily." The cabin froze. Not a whisper, not a breath. All eyes on Thomas. He was cornered now. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his face twisted in disbelief, like the very idea of being held accountable was beyond reason. "You're going to kick me off this plane because of someone like her?" he scoffed, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. His tone wasn't just defiant, it was venomous. That final line, "someone like her," landed like a slap across the cabin. Gasps rippled through first class. A line had been crossed, and everyone knew it. Captain Reed didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. But what he said next would change everything. Captain Reed's voice cut through the cabin like a final verdict. "Mr. Walker," he said calmly but firmly, "let me be absolutely clear. This aircraft will not leave the gate until every passenger is seated in the seat they were assigned. This isn't personal. It's about safety and respect." The words were simple, but their weight was undeniable. Thomas leaned back, jaw clenched, his expression darkening with disbelief. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not like this. But then the captain added something he hadn't expected, something that shook the foundation of Walker's smug confidence. "Perhaps you don't understand who you're speaking to," Reed continued, his voice still level. "Miss Olivia Bennett is not just a passenger. She's the CEO of Bennett Tech Solutions, one of our airline's most significant corporate partners. Your refusal to vacate her seat isn't just inappropriate, it's deeply disrespectful." The revelation hit Thomas like a slap. His grip on control shattered. For the first time, the man who had strutted with entitlement looked completely unsure of himself. The color drained from his face. The wine glass in his hand began to tremble. Around him, the cabin fell into a silence so deep, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Passengers who had once turned away now stared directly at him, some with judgment, some with quiet satisfaction. His mask had slipped, and the man beneath it was no longer intimidating, just exposed. Thomas fumbled for words, his voice cracking. "This is absurd," he stammered, trying to summon the authority he had lost. But it was too late. No one was buying the act anymore. Every eye in first class had seen what he truly was. Olivia didn't move, didn't gloat. She simply glanced at the captain, nodding once, a quiet expression of gratitude. Reed had done more than defend her seat. He had affirmed something much deeper: respect, accountability, equality. And then, from the front of the cabin, the sound of footsteps. Two uniformed officers approached, their expressions calm but firm. Captain Reed stepped aside, letting them take the lead. "Mr. Walker," one officer said, voice steady, "you may choose to exit the aircraft voluntarily, or we will escort you. That decision is now yours." Thomas froze. His eyes darted from the officers to the passengers, then briefly to Olivia. His shoulders tensed, his jaw twitched, but he knew the fight was over. The illusion of immunity had crumbled. Wordlessly, he stood. The seat jolted forward as he shoved it back, the sound jarring in the quiet cabin. Several passengers startled. Some leaned away. He reached for his bag with hands that no longer carried the certainty they once had. Then, without meeting Olivia's gaze, he muttered under his breath, a final attempt to cling to superiority. "Enjoy your little moment. People like you, you're just a trend." Olivia didn't blink. She didn't turn. She didn't reply. Because silence, in that moment, said more than any words ever could. And everyone knew who truly held the power now. As Thomas Walker disappeared down the aisle, escorted by the officers, the mood in the cabin shifted. Where there had been tension, now there was quiet relief. Where there had been silence, now there was understanding. A few passengers subtly nodded in Olivia's direction, some with admiration, others with a silent apology for not speaking sooner. Her strength had left a mark. Every step Thomas took away from that seat seemed heavier than the last. Behind him, the air lightened. In one corner of first class, a young traveler discreetly recorded his exit, not to shame, but to show, to capture proof that dignity had a place, and that arrogance no longer went unchecked. At the front of the cabin, Captain Marcus Reed turned back toward Olivia. His eyes were different now. No longer just the authoritative pilot, he was a man who understood exactly what had taken place. He gave a small nod, one that carried both respect and remorse. Olivia offered a calm smile in return. No celebration, no gloating. Just gratitude for someone who had chosen to stand beside what was right. With a final click, the cabin door shut behind Thomas Walker, sealing off a moment that had already become something greater than itself. Olivia slowly eased back into her seat, adjusting her seatbelt with quiet grace. In her heart, she knew this wasn't about a personal win. It was a reflection of a deeper truth, a reminder that the struggle for equality didn't always roar. Sometimes it stood still and unshaken in the face of cruelty. Around her, the passengers sat in thoughtful silence. Conversations resumed slowly, but their tones were different now, softer, more deliberate. Everyone had witnessed something that would stay with them. Moments later, Captain Reed returned. He walked with quiet purpose and stopped beside Olivia. This time, his posture lowered slightly, his voice gentler. "I'm truly sorry for what happened today," he said. "I have 2 daughters studying law, and I hope one day they carry themselves with the kind of strength and composure you just showed." His words carried more than politeness. They carried respect, gratitude, and the unmistakable voice of a father who understood how the world can be and how it should be. Olivia looked up at him and replied with steady grace, "All I wanted was the seat I paid for, the one I earned." Her voice wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. It was certain, grounded in her self-worth. Captain Reed nodded, deeply moved. Without another word, he turned and returned to the cockpit. But his steps, like hers, left an impression. The atmosphere in first class was calm again. But this time, it was a different kind of calm. A deeper, shared understanding had settled in. Olivia gazed out the window, her reflection merging with the clouds beyond. Soft shapes drifting in a sky that suddenly seemed wide with possibility. She knew the moment would follow her far beyond this flight. Some would praise her, others would reflect on their own silence, and maybe a few would still try to dismiss what happened, but none of that mattered now. Because in that pressurized cabin, 30,000 feet above the noise of the world, Olivia Bennett had reminded everyone of one powerful truth. Dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard, and respect, true respect, is never optional. As the plane rolled toward the runway, a quiet sense of hope lifted with it. Passengers exchanged knowing glances. Some smiled faintly, others sat in reflection, and somewhere in the cloud of shared memory, a quiet story had already begun to spread. A story not about a seat, but about who truly deserves to sit in it. That small cabin, once filled with quiet tension, had become something much larger, a symbol of dignity, justice, and the strength it takes to stand firm under pressure. Olivia Bennett had walked through turbulence not of the skies, but of society itself, and as the plane rose into the clouds, gently leaving the runway behind, the world below was just beginning to feel the impact of what had happened on board. What Olivia didn't yet know was that her story wouldn't end when the cabin door shut behind Thomas Walker. it was only just beginning. Moments after takeoff, a 60-second video appeared on social media. Recorded discreetly by a young woman in the row behind, it captured the confrontation from start to finish. Thomas's entitled remarks, Olivia's calm response, and Captain Marcus Reed's firm but respectful resolution. Within the hour, the clip exploded across platforms: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. Hashtags like Respect Olivia, Dignity First, and No Place for Hate climbed to the top of trending charts. Millions viewed, shared, and commented, turning a private injustice into a public reckoning. Major news outlets picked up the story almost instantly. CNN, NBC, Fox News, and leading business journals like Forbes and The Wall Street Journal ran headlines: CEO confronted in first class, responds with unshakable grace. Public reaction was swift and decisive. Thomas Walker's comments were dissected across talk shows and editorials, exposing a deeper conversation about respect, entitlement, and systemic bias in professional spaces. His past began to surface. Former colleagues and clients describing a pattern of dismissiveness and elitism that now seemed impossible to ignore. In stark contrast, Olivia's composure earned global praise. A top civil rights attorney tweeted, "Olivia Bennett proved that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands still." The post gained over 1 million likes and tens of thousands of reposts. Prominent business leaders and public figures voiced their support. Meta's COO, Sheryl Sandberg, published a powerful message on LinkedIn, calling Olivia's response a masterclass in grace under pressure and a reminder of what real leadership looks like. But not all responses were positive. A small but vocal group attempted to downplay the event, suggesting Olivia should have avoided conflict or simply moved seats. Yet their criticism only revealed a deeper problem: the unspoken expectation that women and people of color should quietly compromise to keep the peace. Captain Marcus Reed's role also did not go unnoticed. The U.S. Pilots Association issued a public letter commending his decisive and fair handling of the situation, calling him a model for aviation leadership. Captain Reed did more than ensure safety, he defended dignity. As the days passed, Olivia received hundreds of interview requests from media outlets, podcasts, and public forums. She declined most, choosing only a few where she could focus on the bigger message. This wasn't just her story. It was about everyone who's ever been overlooked or dismissed and chose to respond with grace. Meanwhile, pressure mounted on Thomas Walker's employer. Within 48 hours, the company released a public statement expressing deep concern over his conduct and confirmed an internal review. His long-held reputation in corporate circles quickly unraveled, and the influence he had once relied on to shield himself faded under public scrutiny. But the impact didn't stop there. By the time Olivia's flight had landed at Dulles International Airport, the airline itself was facing a full-scale public relations crisis. Their leadership, known for professionalism and high standards, acted quickly. That same evening, the company's CEO, Richard Anderson, issued a direct apology across all official channels. The statement was clear and unequivocal. "We do not tolerate any form of discrimination or disrespect on our flights. We sincerely apologize to Miss Olivia Bennett for the unacceptable experience she endured aboard Flight DL-1986. This incident does not reflect our values." But they didn't stop at words. In a rare and symbolic move, the airline revoked Thomas Walker's elite membership benefits and suspended his travel privileges for a full year, a strong signal that status does not place someone above accountability. Olivia's journey had started as just another business trip, but by the time she landed, her story had become a turning point, sparking national reflection on professionalism, equality, and quiet courage, not by shouting, not by force, but by standing tall and never sitting down for anything less than respect. The airline's swift and public decision sent a powerful message: no level of privilege excuses disrespect. And soon after, a more personal moment followed. CEO Richard Anderson, a man known for staying far from the spotlight, picked up the phone himself. He called Olivia Bennett directly. His voice was quiet but genuine. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I've seen the video more than once, and I want to personally apologize, not just as an executive, but as a human being. The way you handled yourself, it left a deep impression." But Anderson didn't stop at words. He extended an invitation. Olivia was asked to join a newly formed advisory council, a group tasked with reshaping the airline's training, management culture, and response protocols to prevent future acts of discrimination. This wasn't symbolic. It was structural. A real opportunity to lead change from within. Olivia listened carefully. She appreciated his sincerity, but she also understood something critical. Good intentions weren't enough. Real progress required sustained, measurable action, not promises made in the heat of public pressure, but commitments carried through in quiet boardrooms and policy rooms long after the headlines fade. Meanwhile, Thomas Walker's world was unraveling fast. His suspension became national news. Once a man who wielded power with ease, he now found himself alone. Colleagues distanced themselves. Former clients stopped returning calls. Even within his own company, emergency meetings were held to reassess his future. The man who once believed he was beyond consequences was now learning the hard truth. Actions have weight, and status doesn't shield you from accountability. Back at the airline, the momentum didn't stop. The leadership team initiated a company-wide reform plan. Diversity and inclusion training, once optional, became mandatory for all senior and frontline staff. Complaint procedures were overhauled to ensure no future incident would be mishandled or ignored. Every step was logged, tracked, and published transparently. Public praise followed swiftly. Commentators and customers alike applauded the airline for its clear, decisive response. "This is what accountability should look like," one business analyst tweeted. "Not a press release. Real reform." As for Olivia Bennett, she saw through the headlines to something deeper. She knew this wasn't the end of a story. It was the start of something bigger, a new chapter in an old fight for fairness, one where she had unexpectedly become a symbol of grace, strength, and resilience. Determined not to let the moment pass without real impact, Olivia accepted Anderson's offer to meet privately with the airline's senior leadership. In that room, there was no anger in her voice, only purpose. "Apologies matter," she began, her voice clear, "but apologies alone won't fix a broken system. Change must be structural, deep-rooted, and lived out at every level of this company." She called for mandatory anti-bias and anti-discrimination training, not just for crew members, but for executives as well. Culture, she reminded them, is shaped at the top. Then she laid out the rest of her plan. Independent, anonymous reporting channels so staff and passengers could speak out without fear. Clear, enforceable penalties for verified misconduct. Time-bound benchmarks with regular public updates to track real progress. "I'm not interested in performative promises," she said, locking eyes with the room. "If you want real trust, you'll need real accountability." And they listened. Not just because of public pressure, but because her vision was undeniable, practical, ethical, necessary. Richard Anderson stood and nodded. "We'll start implementation immediately, and we'll do it publicly. Progress reports, every step of the way." While Olivia forged forward with long-term solutions, Thomas Walker's consequences deepened. His company faced mounting scrutiny. Shareholders demanded answers. HR teams reviewed his past conduct. His career, once bulletproof, now teetered under the weight of public and professional rejection. For the first time, Thomas was forced to reckon with something he'd spent a lifetime avoiding, the cost of unchecked arrogance. But for Olivia, this wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. She hadn't just stood up for her seat. She had taken a stand for fairness, for every person who's ever been asked to move, step aside, or stay silent. And because she did, an entire system had begun to move with her. Bitter and resentful, Thomas Walker clung to his version of events, convinced he'd been wronged. He refused to acknowledge how his own actions had set off the chain of consequences, unraveling his once stable career. But deep down, cracks were forming, and slowly, Thomas began to grasp a truth he had long ignored. No amount of power or privilege can protect you from the fallout of your own behavior. Meanwhile, Olivia Bennett kept her distance from the media storm. She turned down major interviews and avoided becoming the face of a viral controversy. Her message was consistent, unwavering. "I'm not looking to be a symbol," she said. "I'm not interested in fame. What I want is meaningful, lasting change, to protect the dignity and rights of all, not just my own." That clarity earned her something even more powerful than fame: respect. Instead of being framed as a victim, Olivia became a quiet force, an authentic leader calling for real reform. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't grandstand, but her principles, her calm, and her courage lit a spark far beyond what she could have imagined. She understood that cultural change isn't a headline, it's a long, steady climb, a marathon of patience, persistence, and action, and she was prepared to stay in the race. What began as a painful moment on a plane quickly became something larger. Olivia's resolve had awakened something, a wave of reflection and testimony across the country. Social media flooded with personal stories, each echoing a familiar theme. A prominent attorney shared how she was mistaken for the babysitter during a court hearing where she was led counsel simply because she was the only woman of color present. A renowned trauma surgeon recounted being asked to clean hospital rooms because no one could imagine that a young black woman might be the top doctor on call. A tech founder recalled being ignored at her own company's launch event because investors and press assumed someone else must be in charge. These weren't isolated stories, they were windows into everyday realities. Hashtags like #LAC, Speak Up, and Inspired by Olivia began to trend. Not because Olivia chased attention, but because her refusal to be silenced gave others permission to find their voices. She received hundreds of messages. Some were just a sentence or two, but full of emotion. One law student wrote, "Because of you, I finally spoke up in class today when my professor dismissed my comment. I won't stay silent anymore. Thank you for showing me it's possible." Each message reminded Olivia that this moment was no longer hers alone. It had become something shared, something collective. While her name quietly became synonymous with grace and change, Thomas Walker's world continued to fall apart. With his airline privileges revoked and his reputation under fire, his own company called an emergency meeting to assess the damage. For the first time, co-workers who had once stayed silent confronted him directly, and as Thomas attempted to deflect blame onto the media, each excuse only revealed how deeply he still misunderstood the gravity of what he had done. He insisted the outrage was overblown, but his colleagues saw it differently. What they saw was someone clinging to entitlement, unable to admit the harm he'd caused. The company suspended him pending a full internal investigation, not just into the flight incident, but into a broader pattern of complaints that had gone unaddressed for too long. His carefully built authority began to unravel, revealing not strength, but years of unchecked behavior finally catching up to him. In contrast, Olivia's influence continued to rise, not through spectacle, but through substance. Major corporations began reaching out. Apple, Microsoft, Google. They weren't looking for publicity, they were asking for guidance. They wanted Olivia's help designing new training, improving corporate culture, and building workplaces where fairness wasn't just promised, but practiced. She didn't say yes to everyone. She was thoughtful, intentional. Olivia focused on those who had already shown a willingness to act, to listen, and to grow. Because for her, change wasn't about headlines or hashtags, It was about building a world where people are valued for their contributions, not their appearance. And in every boardroom she entered, every conversation she led, Olivia carried the same calm strength she showed that day on the plane. She hadn't asked to become a voice for others, but she was listening now to all those who'd gone unheard, and she was just getting started. Her story, at its heart, revealed one clear but powerful truth. Real change in the world begins when each of us chooses to change our perspective and our behavior. That message, quiet but unshakable, became a beacon, a spark of hope, and it began to awaken courage in those who had long stayed silent. Because of Olivia Bennett, thousands found their voice, not because she demanded attention, but because her actions spoke for themselves. Every story now being shared, every difficult but necessary conversation taking place in offices, classrooms, and living rooms across the country is living proof of the quiet strength she inspired. And yet to Olivia, the meaning of that flight wasn't about attention. It wasn't about going viral. It was about something deeper, awakening belief, restoring confidence, reminding people who had felt invisible that they had always deserved to be seen. A few weeks later, Olivia boarded another flight, this time from New York back to Atlanta. As she settled into her seat in first class, a familiar moment unfolded. At the cabin door stood a young black girl clutching her mother's hand. Her eyes scanned the cabin, wide with curiosity and something else, uncertainty. The kind of nervousness Olivia knew too well. The quiet question, "Do I belong here?" Their eyes met, and in that instant, Olivia saw herself, years ago, facing the same doubt in rooms, board meetings, and planes. A life spent having to prove she belonged in places others walked into without question. But this time, she smiled, not just politely, but with the warmth and reassurance that said everything that needed to be said. Yes, you belong here. You always have. The little girl's face lit up. The worry faded. She turned to her mother, whispered something with excitement, and together they walked into first class as if they'd always known it was theirs. Watching them, Olivia felt something shift inside, something quiet and profound. Every challenge she'd faced, every moment she'd been forced to stand alone, had led to this. It hadn't just been about claiming a seat. It was about helping others claim their place, with pride, not apology. And far from that peaceful flight, in a world of boardrooms and consequences, Thomas Walker's downfall was still unfolding. After a thorough internal review, he was removed from his senior role. His career, once defined by influence and status, had unraveled completely. Colleagues distanced themselves. Former partners chose silence over association. And Thomas? He was left to face the quiet truth. Privilege is not protection. Power without responsibility is always temporary. The damage he caused, to others and to himself, was irreversible. Whether or not he changed was no longer the point. What mattered was that his behavior had cost him the one thing he never thought he could lose, his place. For Olivia, though, that chapter was behind her, not forgotten, but transformed. It had become a milestone, one of many, in her ongoing pursuit of fairness, dignity, and respect for all. She knows that building a better world doesn't happen overnight. It takes every small step, every moment of resolve, and every brave voice willing to speak up. But that doesn't discourage her. It fuels her. As the plane lifted into the sky, Olivia leaned back in her seat, watching the clouds drift beyond the window. She thought of all the people who had doubted their place, held their breath, or stayed silent, and she hoped that her story would remind them of something vital. You matter. Your voice matters, and you deserve to be exactly where you are, because dignity and self-respect, once embraced, are stronger than any obstacle. And as long as we believe in our worth and fight for a future built on fairness and inclusion, each of us will find our place, not just on a plane, but in the lives we lead, the communities we shape, and the legacy we leave behind. If this story moved you, please like the video, share it to spread this message even further, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that uplift, inspire, and remind us all you belong wherever you choose to be.